is Hannah Harrison. I am a tutor in ancient cultures with the short courses department at the University of Glasgow, and I am studying for my PhD in archaeology with the University of Edinburgh. Today I'm going to give a talk on the importance of the written word in Greco-Roman magic. I will begin by giving a brief introduction to magic in the ancient world, and then I will discuss the power that text can have. After which I will move on to an examination of curse materials and a particular case study of the assemblage from the fountain of Annapurna in Rome. So to begin, in the Encyclopedia of Religion and Society, Colin Campbell defines magic as a general term that covers any attempt to control the environment or the self by means that are either untested or untestable. This definition explores the impetus of magic, in that rather than modern fanciful perceptions of magic, it was or is actually grounded in personal reality, serving to reduce anxiety and fill the void of the unknown, aiming to, as Campbell states, control that which would normally be out with our control. In the ancient world, and in some ways the modern world as well, there is considerable overlap between magic and religion. The aims of magical and religious practices are similar. They both invoke divine beings, and one can argue that prayers and incantations are two sides of the same practice. Where they deviate, however, lies in the variation of their formalities. Ancient religion was structured and controlled, with an emphasis on its public nature, with very few exceptions of individual worship, and even those religions and cults that stood outside of the state control, they still held strict to ritual, whereas magic centered around individual practice and was often shrouded in secrecy. Another point of difference is that while religion focuses on the worship of divine beings, magic invokes other supernatural beings along with the divine and attempts, rather than worship them, attempts to utilize and manipulate those powers. Some of the earliest references we have in the Greco-Roman world to magic is in the 7th century BCE descriptions of Greek medical practice, which hint towards being more magical in nature when we compare them to more explicit references to magic in later centuries. In ancient Greece, practices can be read as magic in mythology and pieces of literature from the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. Following into the 4th century BCE, a shift in attitude towards magic becomes apparent, with magic becoming something other and more separate from mainstream traditional culture, and there is the beginnings of a disregard for the traditional divine entities. In Greece, then, magic as a concept develops organically rather than being a conscious creation. This concept of magic then finds its way across the Mediterranean through contact between the peoples of Italy and the Greek city-states during Alexander the Great's campaigns in the 4th century BCE, effectively Hellenizing Rome. This leads to the belief that the Romans practiced magic from the 4th and 3rd centuries, although there is no extant evidence until the late Republic, which is 146 BCE to 31 BCE, which is when terminology that refers to quintessentially Greek magical practice appears in the written record. And even then, it's not until the Augustan period, starting in 27 BCE, that we have any physical examples of magical practice in Rome. This is with the proviso that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And we can quite confidently assume that magic was being practiced in Rome in those few centuries between the contact of Greek culture and our first datable evidence in ancient Rome. What we do really start to see when magic traverses the Mediterranean from Greece to Rome is a shift to the overt disapproval of magic and those involved in the practice. This can be understood through the general adaptation of magical practices over the centuries, which leads to a distrust of the practice itself, but it can also be seen through the lens of Roman unease and rejection of that which is Greek. So while the Romans can actually be praised for their usual syncretistic process of adaptation and incorporation of foreign elements to ease the assimilation of other cultures into the Roman Empire, there was already that sense that magic was something other in ancient Greece before the concept came to Rome, and perhaps this is why it retains that feeling that this is something that can't be trusted. This then goes some way to explaining the legislation passed in 81 BCE, that late Republic terminology that I just mentioned. The legislation criminalises magical practice, although arguments have been made by the likes of J.B. Reeves that the generalisation of the term ars magica gives the impression that this was potentially a blanket ban on magical practice, when in fact the entirety of the law from which it comes, the Lex Cornelia Disicaris et Veneficis, relates to the harm and control over other individuals. This suggests to me that perhaps the distrust of magic was not generalised, but came from the danger it could pose to the lives of those not engaging in the practice. As this law shows, evidence of ancient magic comes not only from physical forms but also from written accounts. These are not limited to legislation and historical texts, but also appear in literary texts. This shows that magic, however it was viewed, was a prominent feature in Greco-Roman society. Otherwise, it would not have been a suitable vehicle to be employed by ancient authors to explore the nature of these societies. Stanley Spithe highlights that what is present when we compare Greek and Roman authors is that Greek witches are generally depicted as young and beautiful, while the Roman witches are old and ugly. So the literary representations mirror this shift in attitude towards magic and magical practitioners, with a perceived understanding that Greek practitioners were essentially morally neutral, whereas Roman practitioners were motivated by selfish intentions. Moreover, while there is a strong emphasis that the formal practitioners are always female, there is literary evidence of male practitioners, for example, in Juvenal's satires or in the work of Propertius. From a linguistic standpoint, we also have masculine endings for all of our terminology, which would suggest to me that there must have been practitioners of both genders, male and female. Otherwise, these gendered endings would have been null and void, and the neuter endings perhaps would have been used instead. In reality, anyone could engage with professional practitioners and magical practices in general. But the representations do tend to skew the perceived proportionality of who was practicing. And even when both genders are included in the practice, the woman is made to be the scapegoat and take the lion's share of the blame. A great example of this is Plancina. She was Piso's wife in the story of the murder of Germanicus, and that is in the Annals of Tacitus. As I previously mentioned, early ancient medical therapies bear striking similarities to magical practice. Amulets appear in both ancient Greek and Roman magical practice and were worn around the body. They can be used for prosperity, but more often than not, they're used for protection against malevolent forces, both magical and medical. Materials used for the amulets included wood, bone, stone, gemstones, as well as herbs and plants. We have recipes citing leaves as the appropriate medium for certain amulets, which, when they have been examined, have contained medicinal properties that were used in some part for ailments throughout history. One of the most famous physicians from the Greco-Roman world was Galen, a Greek citizen working for the Roman elite in the 2nd century CE. He spoke out against magical pharmacy, like those herbal amulets, but he was actually accused of magical practice himself. In this case, it was divination, because of his ability to predict illness progression due to his detailed medical education and innovation. But people in the ancient world wanted to feel better, regardless of the methods. As Nutton stated in 2004, however much Galen might inveigh against magic practices and complain of misrepresentation when he was compared to a sorcerer, those in need of healing took a more liberal view. Given the vast array of aspects of ancient magic that I have just given a very brief introduction to, the question arises, why focus on the textual elements of ancient magic? Language has always been an integral part of religion and magic, and as I said before, prayer and incantation are two sides of the same practice. One important distinction, however, is that for ancient religion, the inclusion of language very rarely came without an accompanying act or ritual, and in fact is considered by some academics the secondary feature to the physical act. For ancient magic, however, the ritual was secondary. Physical objects used in magical practice were used as conduits for the practitioner's power and provided a direction for the channeling of the magic's intention. But in my understanding, speech in any form, prayer, invocation, or incantation, is ephemeral and fleeting. Once something has been vocalized, yes, you have put the intentions out into the world, the energy has been pushed out, but without a means of channeling that energy, how do you ensure it achieves its purpose? For me, that's what the written word in ancient magic does. Like the physical objects, they act to direct and further amplify the intentions of the magic as it physicalizes that which was ephemeral. But whereas an object just suggests and hints at the nature of the magic being used, the use of text states it explicitly by including specifically chosen words, phrases, or entire spells to anchor the magic. It also works in such a way that the magic is continually manifested. Inscription in such a fashion on these objects is intended to last. Therefore, the magic which is anchored to this text is permanently engaged. This means that the choice of words included are important to our understanding of the workings of ancient Greco-Roman magic. These written elements can often take particular forms with regards to the patterns that they make. Although it may be a cliche to refer to the term abracadabra when discussing the topic of magic, given the context of the ancient Greeks and Romans using written language in their magical practice, it is actually quite apt. The term was first recorded in Sorenus Simonicus's Liber Medicinales. He was a physician to the Roman Emperor Caracalla in the late 2nd century CE. He advocated it as a treatment and preventative of malaria and, as part of the symptoms of malaria, for fever too. The intended layout of the amulet follows an inverted triangle, with an edge at the top and a vertex at the base. The full word abracadabra sits along the top edge. Beneath this, the word is written again, but it is indented to fit within the triangular form, and thus the word loses its last letter. This continues until at the base vertex only an A is written. This forms a pattern whereby, emanating from a separate edge, diagonal lines of single letters appear, a row of A's, a row of B's, and so on. Along the remaining edge, this forms another abracadabra. This is a word that, by all accounts, has no linguistic meaning in the Latin language, although there are debates as to the Hebrew or Arabic stems. So why choose it? Is it perhaps the way in which it is written on the amulet that defines its purpose? Perhaps the idea that in this pattern it's drawing out or draining the disease from the body? because in this instance, it is the textual element that defines the shape of the amulet. Palindromic words and phrases are also often included, perhaps for their unique and special forms, which imbues them with a power of their own, which could then emphasize the magic that's being used. This is something that I haven't looked into in great detail, but is on my list of ideas to focus on. However, the best form of Greco-Roman magic for exploring the importance of writing is the genre of curse materials. Here is a little background on the genre. Most regularly, the genre of curse materials is referred to as cursed tablets, because the form of the tablet was the original artifact identified associated with the magic of a curse. The Latin term for a cursed tablet is defictiones, which carries this sense of binding down. And this is a phrase which occurs over and over in cursed material, which is why scholars often refer to binding spells as well. The true purpose of cursed tablets, as Graf argued in 1999, still remains elusive. And this is because of the variety of motivations behind the curses being invoked. We have evidence of tablets for athletic competitions, legal battles, and also sexual desire. But in essence, these curses subjected another human being to one's will, to make the person unable to act according to his or her own wishes. That was also a statement made by Graf in 1999. This expands upon the binding terminology, as by invoking a curse, you were restricting that person's ability to act of their own accord and binding them to yourself, essentially. So, in a sense, you have a double binding. They are being bound up and also bound to you. And in the case of love magic, one can assume that this binding would preferably last. And therefore, my earlier point about the permanent nature of written text would mean that any binding spell that utilizes the function of written text is ensuring the constant and continued engagement of the curse's magic. But there's no point in creating a curse if you have no one to carry it out. As previously mentioned, magic engages the divine, but Beard, North and Price have argued that curses specifically tried to mobilise supernatural powers of the gods against the living. But it wasn't just any god. You had to call upon a god who was known for vengeance, vindication, and most importantly, had a connection to the underworld. And it is these deities and spirits that are invoked which lead to the location in which we find the curse materials. Beard, North and Price refer to these places as appropriate locations. In essence, what they mean by this is that you're attempting to contact gods of the underworld, then a proximity to the earth would be expected to ensure the message is transferred to the nether realms, and therefore we find deposits buried in the earth, in graves, and in wells. The material of cursed tablets are mostly lead, as Beard, North and Price highlight. This is most likely due to it being a durable material, and that's why these forms have been preserved. Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum have recently conducted analysis into the composition of the lead form, but the paper presented by Liu, Zhang and Fu falls a little short for me in that there is no link made between the prevalence of lead alloy and the essence of the curse tablet. I have actually wondered if the alloy was used rather than pure lead because of the connotations of impurity and a murkiness. So maybe there's an ideological link to the underworld, but I could also be reading too much into this. One other important aspect of the form to bear in mind for later on is the folding of these lead tablets and then the piercing of them with nails. Here again, we see that double binding or pinning down. This time, it's manifesting physically. The text, the inscribed curses appear in lengthy formulaic lines. They are long and extremely detailed, making explicit what is to happen in the curse being invoked. The following text came from a curse tablet from Africa. I conjure you, demon, whoever you may be, to torture and kill, from this hour, this day, this moment, the horses of the green and white teams, kill and smash the charioteers, Clarus, Felix, Primulus, Romanus. Do not leave a breath in them. I conjure you by him who has delivered you, at the time, the god of the sea and the air, Yao, Yastao, Aya. So what we see from that text is very, very explicit ideas of what the person invoking the curse wants to happen. Leave not a breath in them. But they don't just want them to be killed, they also want them to be tortured. And this is all perhaps to do with sporting preferences. They don't enjoy the green and white teams. Maybe it's related to gambling. They've placed a bet. There are still so many questions, but we have quite a lot of detail of what they wanted to be involved in the curse. So I'm going to move on to my case study now, the Fountain of Annapurna in Rome. The site was discovered in 1999 when workers were preparing the foundations for a parking garage. Annapurna was an ancient Roman goddess. It's my opinion that the curse tablets had no association with the worship of Annapurna. Instead, they are linked with her dedicated monument, the fountain. As previously mentioned, wells, springs, and presumably fountains held that proximity to the underworld, and as such, were the ideal location for deposits of curse materials. We do see the standardized form, if you can call that, of the curse tablet at Annapurna, which attests to their prevalence in the genre. But I'm going to focus on the deviations that are present in other artifacts in the same assemblage. The Epigraphic Museum in Rome houses the assemblage and labels several of the items as magic containers. They clearly do not conform to the idea of a flat lead tablet. This is why I struggle with the terminology of cursed tablets. I'm aware it relates back to the original discovery of the cursed material, and tablets do remain as the predominant form. However, it's exclusive and is not an accurate or maybe even appropriate descriptor for artifacts related to curses that have been discovered over the years. So, what do we see in this different physical form? Rather than a flat surface, they're cylindrical. They are multi-dimensional. Not only this, but there is an outside to a container, and there's also an inside. And found inside several of the containers were anthropomorphic dolls. I see this as a literal capturing and binding of the person being cursed, and a containment of the curse, so that no one is affected who isn't the intended recipient of the curse. This is similar to, and even an extension of, the folding and pinning of the more traditional tablet forms that I've discussed previously. And as such, we can observe a shift in the importance of the physicality of the curse. What does that mean for the text then, that, as I mentioned, is associated with this type of magic? Essentially, it almost disappears. It's taken over by the physicality of the object. But the important feature I'm meant to be discussing is the text, not the physicality, right? Well, while the lengthy and formulaic text does disappear, the remaining text becomes much more streamlined. Sometimes, even then, the text only lists names. And so we see Graff's claims of vagueness within the genre coming to life, in that we don't know why these curses were invoked, like we do with the more verbose texts, the one that I read out from Africa, um, that appear on the traditional curse tablets. Therefore, a lack of written words can actually have a bigger impact. In this case, it imbues the curse container with a greater sense of mystery and thus emphasizes the magic being used. If this is the case, the words that have been selected for inscription onto the container must carry great importance. This leads me to one of my final points of discussion, the name Seth. Seth was the Egyptian god of chaotic forces who commands both veneration and hostility, and that is Hart's definition, which I feel is a very good way to understand who Seth was. But he also had links to the underworld. The big question is, why would the name Seth, an Egyptian god, appear on a Roman curse object? Firstly, and most importantly, is that the East, and especially Egypt, was supposed to be the birthplace of magic, and therefore a god of the underworld from Egypt would suggest a strong link to Seth's name on the curse material. But I think it can be taken further than that. VoM discusses the appearance of Eros, or erotic love, as a negative figure that attacked human victims with torches and whips. This is the entity that was engaged by erotic love magic, which more often than not revolved around binding spells. One need only think of the impassioned frenzy that Dido, Queen of Carthage, fell into over Aeneas to achieve a similar picture of the intended results of binding love magic. Seth can therefore be connected to the curse tablets as Eros induces chaos and frenzy, and is even thought to be born of the chasm, chaos in the Greek. And this then relates back to Hart's definition of Seth's role. But clearly, if we take that limited amount of text on these containers to reflect the importance of the text included, this places a foreign deity quite high the priorities list of those invoking the curse. Maybe it is as simple as it being the name of a deity, and specifically the deity being addressed to fulfill the curse. However, we see this blurring of cultures, which I think is fitting, as the blurring of boundaries is where magic finds itself in society. To conclude, first, I'm of the belief that the genre of curse tablets should be referred to as curse materials, as tablets is an extremely restrictive category and does not fully represent the full spectrum of curse materials discovered to date. One could argue that for the purposes of examining text content and composition, it can be useful to have a standard form for comparison, as I have done with regards to the effects of text length in this talk. However, the variation in form could in fact represent very different strands of ancient curse magic, so we do need to be careful when referring to standardized forms until we have more conclusive evidence of the nature of ancient curses. Secondly, written text in ancient Greco-Roman magic has several important functions. Written text is an active, conscious decision made by the practitioner and is a physicalization of parts or all of the speech included in the magical practice. Text acts to channel, direct, and often amplify the magic in use. Not only do the words act as an anchor for the magic, working in perpetuity, but I believe that a limitation of the text present speaks to the very nature of magic itself, shrouded in secrecy to such an extent that if these materials were to be discovered at the time, no one would necessarily know the specific curse that had been invoked. This brings me to the end of today's talk. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a lovely day.